Hey, Fleet, thank you for coming in. You just have a really interesting background, remarkable in terms of your spiritual journey. And of course, you had your struggles as well, but you were able to leverage those struggles to do good for the world and to do good for those who come from different kinds of backgrounds. And you got multiple degrees, but that have a psychological, but also a spiritual aspect to it. You're a devout Buddhist. And so let's go through all of that because that helped shape who you are today. And you definitely are a leader within the penitentiary or prison system because of your experiences from that. And but you turn that into one of servant leadership of giving to the world, and it's a great foundation for the things you do. You've created nonprofits. You created some of the biggest programs in the world for those who've gone walked challenging paths, and that was really incentivized, I guess, by your own experience, and then how you leverage that to turn just who you are into one of really peacemaking and giving. You have your Mindfulness Institute. I think it's just doing great work, and of course, you're very much into doing podcasts and things like that as well. You're very experienced in that, and bearing witness to issues and challenges that different regions of the world have been doing, and that's through your peacemaking efforts. So I've never met anybody with your kind of background, right? It's just really, really interesting. I mean, and you've written books, authoring Dharma and Hell, right? And then Interfaith Dialogue with Pope Francis. I mean, just the Zen Roshi title, right? I mean, you name it. It's just a remarkable journey. So. Thank you for coming in and sharing your experiences with our audience. And for the audience, it's definitely unique and so many different lessons that we can learn from Fleet because you're like a master of everything from all of the things you've done.
Well, thank you for having me, Stephen. Great to be here.
So what we're going to do is, and this is a question I ask at the beginning of every interview, is if you can define three inflection points that made you who you are today. And it could have been when you were really young, 3 to 5 years old. It could have been your upbringing. It could have been external influences, things that happened in school. It could be pivotal moments that happened in your life. But if you can sort of define three things that shape you as a person today and shape you continuing going forward, that really were inflection points, awakenings for you.
Yeah. Well, one of my best known book you didn't mention Radical Responsibility, and the only reason I reference that is because I'm going to mention an inflection point here, but not in a sense to blame any of my experience on that, but it certainly did influence the course of my life. But I'm very much into embracing 1 or 200% responsibility for creating my own life. So, but at any rate, I grew up in a Midwestern household in the 1950s. I was born in 1949, and my beloved mother suffered from alcoholism, and it was kind of a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde situation where most of the time she was this incredibly beautiful, artistic, creative, wonderful mother, and while I was in a family of five, I was kind of considered her favorite. Um, but once or twice a week or every other week, you'd come home from school and she'd been drinking and she would turn into this incredibly terrifying rageaholic, alcoholic person. And the home would just erupt into chaos. And if my father wasn't home, she'd come after me. I had an older brother, but he was just started around. He was away at school. And anyway, she'd come after me and attack me violently. And so, I just never really felt safe. So I had that kind of mixed up, confusing thing in my psyche that really influenced the course of my life. And then graduated from high school in 1968 with a big hole in my gut from those kind of experiences and kind of classic angry young man, and just went headlong into the counterculture of that time. And actually, in 1966, the summer after my sophomore year in high school, I discovered marijuana, LSD, and Buddhism all in the same summer. And so my life kind of continued that twisted path for a while. So that, certainly one major influence was growing up in that household where I got a lot of really wonderful things from my family. I mean, really solid, good middle class values, Roman Catholic family, but also the alcoholism that really created a lot of internal pain. And then, the timing that just became the tipping point to go headlong into the counterculture, which again, was kind of what was happening with my generation at the time. I kind of went to extremes with it. Um, and uh, Before I could untangle, I had always been a spiritual seeker and always very interested in the mind. And I ended up doing a deep 3-year clinical training program in a combination of Eastern and Western psychology and psychotherapy. And At Naropa University I graduated in 1979. That was another major inflection point was um, going to Naropa and meeting my teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, a great Tibetan master, who was kind of an iconic figure in the 1970s and 80s, one of the early Tibetan teachers to come to the West, and the founder of Naropa University. So as a result of kind of the counterculture and my pain and confusion, I'd ended up living in South America as an expat, very angry, alienated kind of expat, exploring, not always angry, but I mean, I was exploring archaeology and the indigenous cultures and getting into the whole plant medicine thing, but I was also driven by this kind of social alienation and political alienation and justified, getting involved in criminal activities of being involved with drugs to finance living outside the system, justified that with all this us versus them thinking. And but while I was down there, I was pursuing my spiritual life as well amidst all that confusion, and had really zeroed in on the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and then found out about my Tibetan teacher founding Naropa University. And when I read about that in 1974, I knew I had to go there, and so I managed to come up back to the U.S. and do that. And so I did that 3-year clinical training program, and so I think another major inflection point was just the experience of living in South America, mostly in Peru, but then going to Naropa University, where I really got deep training and met my teacher, and he became my teacher. I became a personal student of his. But before I could untangle all that confusion, because I continued my path and continued financing that by disappearing every now and then and doing a smuggling run out of South America. So before I could untangle all that, I ended up going to prison and earning my way into what ended up being a 14-year federal prison sentence. I was originally sentenced to 30 years with no parole, but it's kind of a story about how the good time works under the old sentencing laws before 1987. But at any rate, I ended up serving 14 years inside, and then it was under supervision for a long time. But kind of that childhood experience, then the counterculture, and this kind of split life of being very involved in my own spiritual growth and development, and also involved in some of the craziness, and still involved in drug smuggling and justifying that in my head somehow. I knew it all had to change, but before I could unwind it, I ended up in prison. And then, of course, those 14 years in prison were just a seminal experience for me. I was in from 1985 to 1999, and my son was 9 years old when I got locked up. And I was absolutely devastated over what I'd done to him. He was going to grow up without a dad, and devastated over what I'd done to myself in my own life and how I'd let down my teacher and my family, because I'd kept all this as a secret from everyone, and and I had to face that. I had to face all the incredibly selfish decisions I've been making for so long, and I became radically dedicated to getting all the negativity out of my life and taking all the good I'd received and doing something good with it. And I wanted to leave a better legacy for my son than just his dad went to prison or even died in prison, because I had no surety I would survive my time. I was 35 when I went in, and when I was sentenced, the next day it said I'd be 65 before I had any chance of release. Fortunately, under the old law, you got a lot of good time if you stayed out of trouble, which I managed to do. And after my appeal went through the courts, they knocked off one count, so reduced my aggregate sentence from 30 to 25. And so on that, I had to serve 14 if I stayed out of trouble, which is not easy in prison. And I was in a place where people were dying. There was death by violence, but it was also maximum security federal prison, hospital in heights of the AIDS epidemic, and people were dying of all kinds of illnesses. So I had no surety that I would survive. But I wanted to create a better legacy for my son than just his dad ended up in prison. So I was really practicing like my hair was on fire. I was very dedicated to creating transformation in that institution. Managed to create two national organizations while I was in there, which you're not supposed to be able to do as a prisoner, that catalyzed two national movements, both the prison mindfulness movement and the prison hospice movement, and really train myself because I knew once I knew, it took about 3 years, 2.5 years maybe for my appeal to go through the courts. So once that went through and once I understood, because I didn't understand how the good time worked until I'd been in for a year or so and figured it out. They don't just come and tell you. Um, so eventually, though, I knew that well, I was going to get out. If I stayed out of trouble, I'd be almost 50. I'd be just short of my 50th birthday when I get out. And starting your life over at 50 with a serious criminal record and in debt is not easy, right? So I knew I really had to train myself. So I focused on really training myself and on really contributing to that world I was in for those years I was there. And it just really paid off because I got out in 1999 and I've had nothing but opportunity ever since, been traveling the world, doing some of the work you described and being able to continue to make a contribution. So I think, my early childhood experiences and the sort of counterculture thing and meeting my teacher, and then the years I spent in prison were the most formative experiences for me.
You describe, this kind of Midwestern sort of upbringing, some, Catholic and good values, but your mother had a disease, right? Alcoholism is a disease and a loving mother, but when the alcoholism took over, then that created a lot of stress, and you were the target of that stress, as you indicated, and that would alter your brain patterns, right?
Absolutely. Hmm.
And um, so like where you um, you must have formed some kind of layers to protect yourself, right? Some psychological layers to protect yourself, or maybe did some dissociation when you were at that very early age, and then maybe that led you to sort of go inward as well on the Buddhism side, right? And
Mhm.
there, that challenge and the complexity of that challenge, of which of no fault of your own, and trying to sort it out made you then explore the spiritual side or sort of maybe drove your curiosity into the spiritual side.
Yeah, today I see that really, I think I love Joseph Campbell's organization of the hero's journey from the world's all the world's traditions and as we know that that begins with some kind of departure, some kind of call, some kind of fall. And so for me, that was really what it began when I was no longer safe in my own home, right? That really that was the beginning of the hero's journey for me. So today I'm actually very grateful for all of it. Um, and I've worked on all these issues around my mom and my parents for many years in different ways, but today I feel actually a tremendous amount of gratitude and I completely understand where her illness came from, and I don't hold her to fault for it at all. And my parents, there wasn't a lot of information around how to deal with alcoholism back in that era. So at any rate, it triggered for me the journey that has carried me forward in my life. So I'm actually quite grateful for all of it at this point.
Yeah, I mean, you're at a stage and through your journey where you can see it's a puzzle, right? And the challenges created this amazing spiritual being that you are, and you reformed. You led multiple reforms within the prison system to give hope and opportunity and another path or multiple paths, right? And you're known for that. And then post prison, just all of the mindfulness work and the books and articles and speaking and podcasts and things like that. And having one of the sort of the fastest growing companies in all of this, and it's about servant leadership, right? How can I contribute to make the world better for not just humanity, but for all? Because Buddhism has this much more broader perspective, just humanity, right? It's kind of like everything's unified and we're all together It's just really, really remarkable. And the fact that you look back and say, you know what, it was a gift ultimately,
Mhm.
because it created this wonderful person you are today, and now you're continuing forward. So you walked us through, your initial years. When you were in school, were you like a good student, or were you kind of like a rebel at that time? Were you interested in the humanities and the arts and sciences, or just it wasn't a focus point? Because you have this kind of academic side to you, right? This
Yeah.
curiosity about neuroscience and psychology and the integration with Zen and spirituality and things like that. So, what were you
Yeah.
from a academic standpoint? Were you
Yeah.
curious or not? Or
Yeah, well, one of my regrets is that I think in terms of being an intellectual or our cognitive capacities in science or what have you, we're really hit our best in our early 20s probably. And I think I wasted a lot of that time. Uh, um, school came easy to me, but I was definitely rebellious because I was troubled with everything that was going on, right? So I was very rebellious, and I had a Catholic school upbringing. I had Dominican nuns for the first 9 years, kindergarten through eighth grade, and they were really intense. And they didn't like me much because they just got the sense of my rebellious nature. But I got great easy grades, right? So that the combination of those things made them like me even less, I think. Then I went to a Jesuit high school, and they're very good educators. I'm grateful for that
right.
education I got there. I could have taken much greater advantage of it than I did. I did okay. But again, I was very rebellious and that, and I was already um, caught up in the counterculture even by my sophomore year in high school there. But I still, nonetheless, just getting through 4 years of Jesuit education, I got a pretty good classic education. And then I went off to a big state university, University of Missouri, and really just majored in drug, sex, and rock and roll there. That was pretty much a waste of time. I was started off in psychology, but I was trying to get out of the language requirements, which I wish I'd studied a lot more language. So then I went to business school, and I really wasn't was not much of a student during my undergraduate years. So it really wasn't until I went back and went to graduate school that I became a serious student, and I've been a self-educator ever since then. I mean, I've read thousands of books, and during my prison years, I read constantly. I had you see in my prison years, I had a job. I taught school, which was great because gave me a sense of purpose and a way to give back. And I was helping fellow prisoners either learn to read or get originally, they had this ABE kind of grade school equivalency, and then they dumped that for the GED. I had to get a GED, so a GED high school equivalency. So I was doing that and also teaching ESL, and I was teaching in both Spanish and English because I'm bilingual. And so that was very gratifying, and I learned a lot there because I'm working with fellow prisoners, and fellow prisoners, you got to be really careful and most of them came in really angry to school, and if they didn't go to school, they'd put them in an ad seg, or the what's called the hole in prison. They'd punish them, and then they'd come back even angrier. And so, if you act in any way with your fellow prisoners, like you're more than, or like you're associated with the staff or something, I mean, be ready to rumble, right? It can get very dangerous. So I had to learn how to really befriend uh, these guys, and then because I most of we were called inmate tutors, but we really did all the teaching. There were some staff there; they were just there to open the doors and close them. In fact, I kind of ran the education department for 14 years. I ordered the books, set a lot of the curriculum, and um, so a lot of the other inmates that worked there as tutors, there were usually two or three, they'd go sit in a corner and tell the guys, look, if you want help, I'll help you, but otherwise I'll leave you alone. You leave me alone, right? They were just scared, right? But I didn't want to do that with my life. I wanted to make a contribution. So I was trying to figure out how I can really help these guys. And I made a few missteps, got some people in my face, got in some dangerous situations a couple times and learned from that I had to really patiently befriend someone. And then once I got a relationship, got their rapport, then I could begin to nudge them in the direction of really trying to learn and get their GED. And I learned a lot through that 14 years of teaching. So So that was my day job. So I was busy. So I got up very early in the morning to practice my meditation practices. I was getting up at like 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, practicing till I went to breakfast at 6:30. And then I'd have my work day. And then once we started the hospice program, we started the first hospice program in a prison anywhere in the world. And this was the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in the height of the AIDS epidemic. So they're bringing the AIDS patients from all over and from the federal penitentiaries because the patients brought to this prison were all from the highest level of security federal penitentiaries like Lewisburg and Lompoc and Atlanta, places like that. And so they're bringing them all there, plus men were there dying of liver disease and heart disease and all kinds of things. And so I spent a lot of my free time, my meals and free time in the evenings up in the hospital doing that caregiving. I led a meditation group twice a week in the chapel. I was very involved in my own substance abuse recovery and 12-step programs once a week, but also I was sponsoring a lot of people. So I was leading a very, very active life. But then you had to be back on your unit at 9 o'clock. And they counted again. They counted there, and then you're in your room, and lights are out usually at 10:30, but some guards didn't enforce it. But anyway, at 9 o'clock you're in your room, and so I used that time for more study and practice. So I studied and read, 2.5 hours a night, and then I would practice again late at night because that's when it was quietest. And so I was only sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night for like the first 8, 9 years of my time, and somehow I got away with it back then. I couldn't do that now, but I was incredibly motivated. And so I was really studying very intensely and educating myself, mostly Buddhism, and psychology primarily. And uh, and then, ever since I've been out now for 26 years, but I'm a voracious reader. I'm still a self-educator, constantly educating myself. So I wish I'd had that intellectual fire back in when I was in high school and college because that's when your brain has its most capacity, right? But I kind of wasted those years.
It's interesting though, if you look at some of the recent research, they're now maybe finding that intellectual big capacity is maybe to your mid 30s. So it's actually being extended. So it
Mm.
used to it used to there used to be this thinking you're peaking at 18 and then it
Hmm.
gets kind of pushed up, further along. And now I think it's into the 30s. What they're realizing because they can get more granular, right? What's happening in the brain.
Hmm.
So but your Tibetan practice, your meditation, your mindfulness aspects, your hospice work, the first in the entire prison system globally, and then becomes a model for the way to do this, and also your teaching, but your teaching, you're learning about trust and building trust, and through that trust, that's an integral part of teaching. Have you written a book on teaching? I mean, you could write a book on teaching, right?
Yeah, I probably could. Yeah, no, I haven't. No. I
Because
covered
can
that a
you?
little bit. I think I reflected on that a little bit in my book, Dharma and Hell, which was really a collection of essays I wrote while I was in prison and got published in various journals. And then when I got out, a colleague of mine, who's the executive director of Prison Mindfulness Institute, put that into a little book that got published. I think there might be a chapter in there about the teaching, but yeah, I think I could do a book on that.
Yeah, can you imagine doing a book on teaching and then training an LLM, an AI on your teaching methodology or approach, the trust building,
Hmm.
and not being an imposer of education, but being a servant leader or an agent. That person's a agent. You're working for them. You're serving their need of their educational journey by building their trust. You can do that, and then you're in step with them, right? And I think there's some very valuable lessons that should be taught in all teaching institutions of people who are going to become teachers, right? Because you did it, and through experience and self-study, and because you're such a voracious reader, it's like you got like 10 PhDs, right? It's really quite just fascinating and inspiring as well, right? And so I really recommend that people kind of delve into your profile and attune with everything you do and support and follow your work and mine it even further because there's just so many lessons and valuable catalyst for everybody's journey in the world, right? Because you've lived it and you continue to live it. So, okay, so you had this intense process in prison of self-transformation, but also transforming the whole system in remarkable ways on your own educational journey and your own teaching journey of learning and sharing. And then you're about to be released. And how do you manage that? How do you manage, because you're so used to now that experience, right? That's you lived a day and night. You were sleeping, for maybe 4.5 hours a day for the first 8 years. So how do you manage that transition? What was that experience like of saying, oh, okay, I'm in this system, I've contributed to it, the programs are going to continue. I've been able to be part of the transformation of the system. I'm now part of a bigger collective, a global collective of meditation and oneness. And then how do you anticipate what happens when you're walking out that door? How do you plan? What did you think at that time?
Yeah, that whole transition was very interesting. Actually, my parents, my father, who had, I was really hopeful they would get to see me outside of prison, right? And by that time, they knew I was doing well with my life, and they were proud of what I was accomplishing inside. But my father and mother both got lungs cancer. She got lung cancer. They were smokers. She got lung cancer first, but then went into remission after treatment. Then my father got lung cancer, and he ended up dying before I got out. And they were going to let me go home to go to the funeral or go to the hospital, but they insisted that I be in uh, uh, a belly chain, handcuffs like this with two guards, right? And I said, I'm not going like that. I told the warden, I'm just not going like that. I've brought enough shame to my family. I'm not going to show up at the funeral like that with guards and that. And he said, well, it's your father. You should go. I said, I'm just not going like that. And so the morning my father passed, they called me down. They said, you're going out. And they released me and they gave me 72 hours with no guards, no nothing. They, uh, they gave me some kind of a cheap sports jacket to wear and some slacks, and they gave me $50 out of my commissary account. They called a taxi, and I had a airline ticket at the airport. And so I got out of prison. I was out for 3 days, home with my family for my dad's funeral. And that was the first time I'd been out, in almost 14 years. And I remember that day of standing on the steps waiting for that taxi, and it was a beautiful blue sky day, and the flag they had flagpoles outside of prison, and the flags were kind of beating in the wind, and I was just so full of grief. My father had just died, and I was just saturated with grief and pain, and at the same time, I was full of this exhilaration about being out, being alive, and it was just one of these incredibly powerful moments of my life to be so emotionally present and alive in pain, but at the same time, it's hard to describe. But anyway, so I had that experience and I came back. And then when I got out, I should have been more prepared for this. I'd heard many guys that went to halfway houses or they got out and they talked about, and they come back, right? And they got violated for some reason. Always got the stories about it. And, I was always pretty cynical about all that by that time. So I always kind of, I wondered how much they really created that situation for themselves. But anyway, so I get out and I flew to St. Louis, and fortunately, this was before 9/11. So my mother and one of my sisters met me at the airport and were able to be on the concourse and hang out with me while I was waiting for my second flight for a couple hours. Very grateful for that time because that was the last time I saw my mom. Um, and then I flew to Denver, and I was releasing going back to Boulder, Colorado. And so a woman who had been my girlfriend before prison and had remained close, she'd gone on with her life, of course, and what we both wanted, but we remained very close friends. So she had come there to pick me up with my son. So they picked me up at the airport, and I mistakenly I had to go to the bathroom, so I went to the bathroom before leaving the airport. Then we drive to Boulder, and it was very emotional coming back in there. And I mean, it was a really emotional experience just re-entering that space where I'd been with my teacher, and it's just his presence there was very powerful. He had passed a long time previously. He died in 1987. I got out in 1999. But at any rate, so then they take me to the halfway house. And I get to the halfway house, and it was like re-entering a jail. And I hadn't really prepared myself for that. It was like getting arrested and booked all over again, and same kind of environment, same kind of psychology. And then they wanted to do a urine sample, and I've always been had a shy bladder around those kind of things. They did them periodically in prison. Somebody watching it was kind of hard, and I just couldn't do it, and I couldn't do it, and I couldn't do it. And I'm drinking water like crazy, and I couldn't do it. And then they're telling me they're going to violate me because if I can't give them a urinary sample within like 45 minutes or an hour, you get violated, sent back to prison. I go, boy, I'm going to be another one of these stories with my story about how unjust it was. I got sent back, and uh, and they let me go about, I don't know, almost 40 minutes beyond the limit. I finally was able to pee, but I drank a couple gallons of water. So I'm up all night. I'm getting up all night to go pee, right? And so I barely slept. And I hadn't slept the night before with the anticipation of getting out of prison. I couldn't sleep the night before I got out. And so that next morning, now I haven't slept 2 nights. And I woke up that morning with, fell asleep for a little bit. I woke up and I saw myself in the mirror, and I looked like I'd aged 20 years. 'Cause before I left prison, I thought I looked pretty good for 50, or almost 50. And suddenly I thought I looked like I was 65. Anyway, that was kind of a rough transition. Then the other thing about getting out, so I was in a halfway house, which was all about control. There was no real support at all. It was really a terrible place, and they're just making money. It's a for-profit halfway house, and there's all these rules. They won't even give you the rule book, and so it took a while before I could even leave the place. But eventually I was able to, and I had a job. Fortunately, um, uh, I had brought somebody into the prison to do this training called the event for the last 4 years that I was in the prison. We'd gotten in touch. They'd learned about my work. We learned about their work. I managed to get them into the prison to do this really intensive training. We did 4 of them while I was still in prison. Very, very intense work. Very interesting program that was actually started in a maximum security prison in Marion Federal Penitentiary, the Supermax at that time, back in the 70s by a psychiatrist named Martin Groter and an inmate named Kenny Wines. And then it went out into the public. Kenny got out eventually. He was never supposed to get out, but he got out. And he's doing this training out called The Game. And eventually my friend Perna Steinitz received it for him, took it over and called it The Event. And anyway, we got in touch. And so we were doing that work in the prison, which was incredibly transformational. And so uh, he had a consulting company, and he set me up with an office and gave me a little stipend. So I started walking initially over to this office from the halfway house. And I had to call back in all the time. If I wanted to go to the bathroom, which was down the hall in the building where I was, I had to call in. I was very, very, very controlling. And I was going to try to develop a consulting business. And I thought I was going to go continue to do trainings with him and work with him, but he didn't have any business in Colorado, and they wouldn't let me leave Colorado. So I just had to try to figure it out on my own. And I started scrambling around doing this process we had called the Leonardo process, which is kind of a storyboarding, creative design process using a lot of visuals on boards and stickies and all that kind of stuff. And anybody even let me do it for free. I did work for the University of Colorado, did it for a lot of places. Eventually, I got a bicycle, and I was bicycling, and so I would bicycle over to some company, hide my bike in the bushes, and go in with my suit, my briefcase, and say, I want to be your management consultant, right? And it took me about 6 months, but I got my first client, and my it was actually I had a little yellow page ad. So they called me, and there was this couple that had this business in Oriental medicine. They both were the major publisher of textbooks in classic traditional Oriental medicine. They had online courses, and they also had a formulation business for medicines. And they were kind of all over the place, and the business was driving them crazy. They were working too hard. They were baby boomers, and they wanted to either fix the business and sell it, or fix it so they could, only do what they specialized in doing, and because the business was kind of killing them. And he said, we need a business plan. And can you help us? And I said, absolutely. Of course I can help you. And somehow they interviewed me, and out of 10 candidates, they hired me. I still don't know how that happened because I was completely inexperienced. But I worked with them very successfully, got them to where they wanted to go. At one point, they visited my office and they saw I had these books on business, doing business plans and so forth. And they said, was that the first business plan you ever did? And I just kind of I didn't answer yes or no. But they were very happy, and their business ended up being very successful. So I was off and running. I negotiated a $5,000 a month retainer with them, and I was off and running as a business consultant. So that was my primary livelihood for at least the first 20 years of being out was working mostly with smaller privately held companies, anywhere from 5 to 300 employees, anywhere from 5 million to maybe 25 million in sales. I like working with companies where I can kind of would definitely have a direct relationship with the CEO, the owner, and get my arms around the whole company and really work with it and take them through long-term change processes. I did a little work with Fortune 500 companies, but it's very political and hard to really know whether you're making a difference, right? So, but that was mostly my professional work and my livelihood. I was very involved in growing in the nonprofit as well, but my livelihood came from the consulting work for the first 20 years when I got out. But the other thing, I'm sorry, I went off on that tangent, but for the first I don't know, first 3 or 4 months I was out, it just felt like the world was going so fast. I wasn't prepared. It was scary to walk across streets. It's just everything was so fast, right? Compared to being in that prison. Literally, I mean, viscerally and physically, it felt like it was just scary fast. It took me a while to get used to that. And I was very awake because of the transition. Fortunately, the familiarity is the bane of all awakening. So eventually I adjusted and it became normal. And then I had to work at my awareness again, work at being awake, right? But when I first got out, I was very awake, but that transition was quite striking and powerful. And I really understand now. I had a greater compassion for all those men who got sent back and violated. I'm sure they may have contributed to it, but I came out with no chip on my shoulder, incredibly positive attitude, all kinds of skills, all kinds of support, and I was on the edge of getting violated all the time. In fact, another thing happened once when I moved from the halfway house into a Buddhist residence that we had there in Boulder in the community, and I was still under house arrest, and I had to do all this complicated reporting. They called me in the middle of the night one night, and I didn't answer. I was asleep. I didn't hear it, and because I didn't answer the phone, they were going to violate me. And it was only because it happened on a weekend that they hadn't reported me to the marshals yet. By the time they did on Monday, the marshal said, "Well, you've been back on the clock for 24 hours, so we're not going to send you. We should have sent you back. If the guy had done his job, you'd be back in prison already, but you got a lucky break here, right?" So I could have, even though I was doing everything right, I easily could have gotten violated and sent back. So I had more compassion
Wow.
for all those gentlemen that had had that experience.
Yeah, and because you had all of this self-learning where this kind of internal locus of control, right? Psychologically, you had this internal locus of control. You managed your future. You took responsibility, and that was part of your transition when you initially went in, is you taking responsibility and accountability, and then your self-learning would then allow you to adapt and be agile. And that would be rare, though. It'd be hard for people who didn't have that kind of self-actualization, internal locus of
Mhm.
control, and not looking for some kind of outside influence to determine that you took control and said, I can manage this. And it's like you researching, business plans so you can construct. You took control of that situation rather than, waiting for external forces. And I can see then that being an enabler of this is just tremendous success, both even in the other activities prior to prison, and then in prison, just being phenomenally meaningful contributor, and that from a definition of success standpoint, right? You evolved and you were able to contribute in a meaningful way and help people in their lives, but working with them, right?
Mhm.
And then including with your teaching, working alongside with your colleagues, and then in management consulting, I can see you're doing the same thing. You wanted that personal relationship with the CEO. It's a peer-to-peer. I'm here to work with you. I'm not here to demonstrate over you or things like that. So you're working hand in hand, and I guess that ethos, I mean, you continue to do that, and I guess that would very much tie in with your meditation practices, your Buddhist practice, your Zen practices. Earlier, you were in South America where you got a chance to observe indigenous culture, and that's a big part of your of what you do. Can you give maybe the audience some insights about indigenous, what it means to you? There's a tendency for centuries, I mean millennia, I guess, where certain cultures would look at indigenous culture and say, "Oh, that's behind. It's not." And now, if you look at even sort of the leading areas of science, they're now thinking, wow, no, there's a lot to this oneness idea. Even in quantum physics, maybe there's more of this, there's a connection in some way. Even this idea of entanglement and superposition in quantum physics, maybe there's some connection in some way. And all of this appreciation of this oneness and the soulfulness of everything. It doesn't just have to be humans, it's everything. But those are indigenous philosophies dating back tens of thousands. And if you go to India and things like that, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, right? I mean, can you give your perspective on that? Because you had early experience with that as well.
Yeah, I think even being involved in a counterculture, there was a kind of openness to those mindsets and to indigenous cultures. Although I think in a very naive way at that time. And then when I was living in South America, I was all through my travels. I traveled all through Central America and a lot of South America, but ended up living in Peru and living up in the Sacred Valley of the Incas, high up in the Andes Mountains, and so I was surrounded by indigenous culture, and I'd been very interested in the archaeology and all the ruins, and had visited ruins throughout Central America and South America, and um, and I was living right in the midst of a place that's nothing but ruins there in the Sacred Valley, and where Machu Picchu is, and I was working on a small farm there, and working with the local indigenous farmers, and we would when it was planting or harvesting time, we would go around and collectively work each other's fields, right? And so I was immersed in a culture a lot. I really regret that I didn't have training like as an anthropologist, and again had not been a more proactive student in my college years, undergraduate years, because I would have been able to benefit a lot and learn a lot more. So I think I was had a direct experience of indigenous culture there, but I think I learned a lot more about indigenous culture later on. And through the work at Heart Mind Institute, once we started doing our summits in 2020, um, many of our summits have included indigenous elders. I probably have interviewed probably 15 or 20 amazing indigenous elders, and I've also spent time with the Lakota people up in the Pine Ridge area up in South Dakota, and I have a friend who studies very directly there, and so I have a lot of relationships in those worlds, and have really learned that indigenous culture and mindset is incredibly different than our own. The language is very different. You know, our Western languages are the subject-object language has a kind of inherent violence in it, which Marshall Rosenberg, the founder of nonviolent communication, pointed to, that there's always this objectification. Even if I compliment someone, you know, there's a certain objectification, and the possibility of the opposite of that is always there, right? So, but their language is not set up in that subject-object way. It's a very non-dual kind of language. And there's a lot of terms we have in Western culture that are kind of inherently violent and judgmental terms that they don't even have in their languages. I've learned the most about Lakota, and so the whole mindset is much more different. And of course, what I think is well known to a lot of people today is that indigenous people have a very different relationship with our first mother, the earth, and with the natural world altogether. They feel completely part of the natural world and not superior to it. You know, we have this Western idea of at best being stewards, but more previously, it's been more like we have the dominion over the earth and we can exploit the earth, right? Which has led to kind of where we are today with climate change. But they don't see themselves, you know, they might see themselves somewhat as stewards, but more like participants, right? They
Right.
see themselves on an equal level with all the beings and with the natural world. They're participants in it, and they're not separate from it. So they have a naturally more non-dual relationship. Now that's that's classical indigenous culture, and of course, and I think it's true even for many indigenous people living in our Western world and modern world have been able to maintain those mindsets and ideas and spirituality. But of course, they're affected by Western culture too. And of course, young people growing up and getting Western educations, it's a challenge for indigenous peoples for their young people to maintain, to help their young people not get caught up in just Western psychology and Western values. But I've been fortunate to have good relationships with a lot of really phenomenal indigenous elders, and they just they have a way of communicating that I have a friend Chokes and Ghost Horse who lives in New York City or outside of New York City. He lives in New York State, and he's had a phenomenal radio show. He's a phenomenal musician, and but I've interviewed him 4 or 5 times. And every time I interview him, I know he's going to be challenging even my questions. Like he'll deconstruct my questions because my questions are coming out of this, Western language framework, right? So he'll challenge it right off the bat. So the interviews are always very interesting in that way. But yeah, I think the one I was able to interview. I hope I won't get the Albert Marshall. Yeah, Albert Marshall. He's with the Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia, and he's famous for this idea of two-eyed seeing, and justifiably so. Can be a lot of indigenous folks that can be kind of angry towards non-indigenous folks and have a lot of issues around separation and but his view was we have to bring the two together. We have to be able to see with both the modern Western or but the modern eye and the scientific eye and the indigenous eye. And he feels there's an integration of those two that can really help us meet the challenges we face today. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And there's a lot of indigenous people that share his ideas that somehow we can come together and bring forward the best of modern scientific understandings and the best of indigenous mindset and understandings and bring those together to tackle the really challenging problems we face today.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting how the world is sort of coming together and some of these ancestral, very old wisdom and recognizing the value. And you would have seen that in helping that couple, one of your first consulting projects, right? Because they were in traditional Chinese medicine and on the pharmacy kind of side as well. So you'd get an aspect of that and working to ensure that couple's success when you came as a business consultant. Now, you did 20 years roughly of consulting and a very, very successful um, time in doing consulting with medium and small businesses. You did some large ones as well, but you like that kind of peer-to-peer with an entrepreneur or CEO and working with them and growing their business in whatever ways that you thought would be the best for them and had this remarkable success. But in 2019, you have this founding of the Heart Mind Institute. We don't have a lot of time left. We're actually going a little bit over. So one things I want to go through just very quickly is what caused you to say, you know what, I want to start the founding of the Heart Mind Institute because you're an amazing digital education media company. You've been, fastest growing. You've got those kind of recognitions. You got online summits, courses, coaching programs. You've got self-improvement, mindfulness, wellness. You combine wisdom with modern neuroscience. I mean, what created that shift to founding of the Heart Mind Institute?
Yeah, well, as I was doing my consulting business, I've been tracking the development of online transformational education and digital marketing and following people like Jeff Walker and other people doing those kind of things. And I wanted to start offering online courses. And I started to offer some online courses through my company, Windhorse Seminars and Consulting, which was my consulting company. And so I developed Windhorse Online. And I was trying to figure out the digital marketing thing, but I just didn't have enough bandwidth, time to really. I finally found somebody to partner with, a guy who'd actually been training in the event, that transformational workshop I referenced earlier. So we started working together, and he was very techy and able to learn that. And I'd already been involved with summits because I'd helped others summit companies, I had big networks, so I helped them find good speakers, and I was a host on summits and an interviewer, guest on summits. So I knew about the summit model. And when the pandemic started and the lockdown started, around March of 2020, I just had this flash in my living room one day. We need to do a summit resilience. We're going to really have to focus on resilience here to get through this thing. And we should do a summit on resilience. And I said to my wife, and she goes, "Yeah, you're crazy. You're so busy already." And I said, and then she thought about it. She came back, "No, I think you're right. I think we should do it." So I called my business partner. I said, "We're going to do this summit, Global Resilience Summit." And so we put it together, just the three of us put it together very quickly. And it was successful. The first one went in May of 2020, and that kind of we had just started Heart Mind Institute and was actually in debt. That got us out of debt, and we're off and running. And we went from having an email list of 4,000 to 40,000, and we're off and running. And now we do a summit every month. A lot, some of them are encore hybrids, but we do about 5 or 6 new summits every year, and we've been going full bore since back in 2020 with the summit model. So that's how it got going, and but it was really kind of the culmination of everything. Our work is really at the intersection of, as you mentioned, ancestral wisdom with current neuroscience and biofield science and positive psychology. And this is everything that fascinates me. And the incredible thing about Heart Mind and my participation, I get to interview all these brilliant people. I mean, over the last 5 years, I've interviewed some of the most brilliant people in the world, and I learned so much from them. Many of them have become peers in college because I've interviewed them many times, and that's just been really, really a blessing, and been part of my own education process.
I mean, you have this mission to introduce 1 billion people to the experience of unconditional innate goodness and fundamentally shifting society towards compassion. I mean, it's just such a great idea and more than a concept, you're actually executing on it. You have the Radical Responsibility book, and you released your second major book, Radical Responsibility: How to Move Beyond Blame, fearlessly live your highest purpose and become an unstoppable force for good. Yeah. Just an amazing sort of part. You talked about resilience, but you have the Resilience Code, right? So a resource you co-author the Resilience Code, a neuroscience informed mindfulness, faith, wellness, and resiliency for correction professionals guide. I mean, it's amazing. You've got the neurosomatic or somatic mindfulness. So a meditative approach. I mean, where does it end? You got your recognition in the Inc. 5000 in 2024. You got the recognition in the Inc. 5000 in 2025. These are kind of like the top fastest growing private companies. You got your current roles and future roles, right? And particularly in the Zen peacemakers and things like that. I mean, um, unfortunately, I wish we had more time because we could then explore this in so much more detail. I'm going to have to start wrap this up into a two-part question, and the question is, um, so definitely the audience needs to mine all of this. And if you don't have the links to all the books in your profile, I can't recall now, please put all the links into the resources you have if they're not already in your profile, um, and resubmit it because I want the audience to know all the resources you've created. And so it's readily accessible and so I can point people to it. The other thing too then is you're doing just continuing doing such amazing work. What kind of recommendation do you leave the audience? And I recommend the audience look at all the resources that are going to be in your profile, right? And engage. And then what questions do you want to leave the audience? Questions that people should be asking themselves. So two-parter.
Well, I think the most important thing today is maybe the notion of meta learning, how to learn. And the world is changing so quickly. Even our business, we hit the Inc. 5000 list 2 years in a row. And this year we've been really challenged because AI is changing everything. And it's really having a huge impact on the online education business. And so we're having to pivot and innovate. I mean, I'm really having to earn my chops as an entrepreneur this year, and figure out how to set our company up for profitable scaling in this new reality. And the world's changing so quickly, it's hard to predict where things are going. So the best skill any of us can really have is learning how to learn, how to adapt, how to change, right? Because in order to sur thrive, much less survive, much less thrive, as the world is changing so quickly, we really have to change and adapt with it. And so, learning how to learn and what to focus on, right? And of course, we can use AI very, very proactively, and that can be very helpful. But still, we have to develop this ability to recognize what are the skills that I need to learn to continue to grow and adapt and to the world as it is. And it's a very exciting time to be alive. We have access to all the wisdom of the ancient world's wisdom traditions, current science, the what's evolving in terms of not only neuroscience but biofield science and quantum theory, but the vast accelerated change AI is bringing forward, and we have big change problems to tackle with all that. But I think for any of us, the most important thing we can focus on is really focus on how do I organize my own mind and organize my own time to always be in a learning mode. So I'm developing new skills and new abilities and staying apace with or even ahead of what's going on in the world.
Okay, so and then also study all the resources that you're going to provide in your profile because that's an enormous wealth of experience and context there for people to improve. And then what maybe one or two questions you want people to ask themselves.
Yeah, well, I think one really important question is what's the question that really drives my life? What am I always asking myself, right? I mean, I know because of my childhood experience for a long time, the question driving me was how do I stay safe? And that can be a very self-limiting question if you're always trying to stay safe, right? So really kind of doing some introspective work and seeing what is the kind of question that's driving us and really recognizing that, we're constantly creating our own reality and we're creating it based on our beliefs and our values and the rules we have about how our values get met or not get met. There's this internal psychology, and we have to learn enough about that to really establish that internal locus of control and get into where we're actually, my next book is called Radical Self-Leadership. So it's about getting in that leadership position with ourselves. And to do that, we have to have enough understanding. We don't have to become PhD psychologists, but we have to be what I think Tony Robbins calls becoming a practical psychologist. Understanding enough about our own psychology so they can really get in the driver's seat of our own life and create what we want to create. So I think it's asking ourselves some questions like what are the belief systems and the values and the rules I have about how the world's supposed to interact with me for me to be happy or unhappy? What are all these and are these values and rules and beliefs that I have and the kind of primary question driving my is that really serving me currently or is it really limiting me? So I think that doing that introspective work is really important.
So, I can't, Fleet, you just have such an amazing mind and you definitely have practiced self-actualization as well, but in harmony with the universe, right? In harmony with everything. And there's only one fleet. And hopefully there'll be many fleets from this interview and from your work and, from your institute and all the books and all the contributions you made. Fleet, it's just a wonderful journey. Thank you for sharing your time with me. So thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me, Stephen.